There's a lot of toing and froing in the argument about the role of the working class and the role of the trade unions and so on. And of course, there's been a major book fairly recently by Peter Lim, which has given a strong critique of the established view of the domination of the middle class, talking the way in which it was so small, in fact it was always in touch with the ground and so forth. Nonetheless, I think that it is very clear that the black middle class played a very important role within the ANC. But then, of course, we need to be nuanced the way in which we think of its political role, necessarily, perhaps, given the sheer weight of white political domination. Its goals and vocabulary of protest were, in the earlier period, largely legalistic, very defensive. And it was only after the replacement of the conservative Zuma Old Guard by the Youth League from 1949 onwards that the ANC launched out onto the road to becoming a mass movement, and a major nationalist cross-class alliance took shape. I think the second major qualifier I would add is that the black middle class support for the Liberation Project was never unanimous, certainly never unambiguous. I think a first theme of the literature is that, especially after the clampdown on the liberation movements in the early 60s, many, if not most, middle-class Africans were acquiescent to racial subordination, a situation which was to be subject to a major generational challenge in 1976 via black consciousness in Soweto and so forth. I think another theme is that black middle class elements in their ambition for improvement or change served on various official structures, whether they were municipal boards, municipal advisory boards, and so on. And later this moved over into participation in the various homeland structures. And then from the 1970s, increasingly, black middle class involvement, again in revamped municipal structures which the which the National Party introduced, and granting black municipalities increasing powers from the early 1980s and so on. And what we have in the 1980s is, in fact from the 1970s, is a growing attempt by large-scale capital and the National Party to bring about the growth of the black middle class as a buffer. The extent to which that succeeded is, of course, also subject to a lot of debate. I don't think any of these qualifications refute the major narrative of the black middle class under apartheid as a leading component of the liberation movement. Clearly, if we look at the composition of the ANC in exile. Interestingly, if you look at Hugh McMillan's recent book on the ANC in Lusaka, it's interesting, it's only a passing comment, but I was interested in the way he was talking about the way the old guard in the ANC had quite a lot of difficulty dealing with the people who'd come out after Soweto, because rather than being the uneducated peasants and workers who had usually composed the composition of MK and so forth before that, these guys, he said, were middle class. I don't know what he means by that, but it was clearly something, I think it's an interesting comment. So, I'm accepting the broad proposition, but with nuances. So, proposition 2. Oh, sorry, I'm not keeping up with my technology. Right. The black and middle class is a product and proponent of the ANC. I think it's important for us to recognise the origins of the black middle class go back a long time. I've been talking about that if we look at the historical literature, the classic literature, going back through Leo Cooper and various other writers from the 1960s and so on. So you get that early black middle class. And then, just as I've been talking about, the increasing growth of the black middle class inside the structures of the apartheid political economy from the 1970s. And I think it's important for us to remember that we can talk about two streams of the black middle class, if you like. But in line with, after 94, in line with the theory of the National Democratic Revolution, which requires that the vanguard party captures the strategic centres of power, the ANC has deployed its chosen personnel to key positions in state and society. In theory, the ANC selects people who are dedicated to revolutionary duties, etc., but also according to their qualifications and abilities. However, increasingly, as we know from simple reading of the media over the last few years, and as even the ANC has come to appreciate, the outcomes of deployment have become increasingly problematic. At all levels of the state, there's been a marked tendency to prioritise loyalty to the party, or often factions within it, over merit within many appointments. Nonetheless, I think deployment has emerged as a major instrument whereby a lot of individuals have secured income and employment and have thereby gained opportunity to ascend in the class structure. The second instrument of class formation has been the ANC's strategy of affirmative action, and I would add that this overlaps with deployment. It's very difficult to actually disentangle deployment from affirmative action. The outcome has been most dramatic in the public sector, which the ANC has sought to render democratically and demographically representative. And if you look at the way in which the composition of the public sector has changed, it is getting pretty well near to being demographically representative today. In so doing, it has massively widened the access for its own political constituency to state employment on terms and levels of remuneration, which today seem to be relatively generous compared to what's available in the private sector. Today, in the private sector is similarly subject to pressures from affirmative action, legal and otherwise, to implement employment equity. And that, for all its limitations, is also taking place. The third, I think, major mechanism of upward mobility has been the increase in educational opportunities for blacks at both secondary and tertiary levels, which has been absolutely fundamental. The two processes run together. On the one hand, there's been a very impressive expansion in the absolute number of places for blacks at both state schools and institutions of higher education, such as this. Deracialisation of education has massively widened access of blacks to schools which were previously white and to higher educational institutions which were previously white. Educational opportunity under apartheid was obviously heavily skewed by race, now far less so. And I think the most notable feature of the transformation has been increased African and black entry into those institutions which were previously white. You don't get the reverse happening. Go to Fort Eyre or to University of Edinburgh, you don't get a bunch of white students. So there's been massive movement into the previously white institutions, Model C schools and so on. This is in part, but also why the, obviously access to a better education, but also it was linked particularly with the access to former Model C schools, is the ability of, from 94, of such schools to be able to charge fees. On the one hand, this allows them to hire more staff and so forth, and to maintain their higher standard of facilities compared with township schools. Secondly, clearly fees can be used to exclude people without the money. So you've got a funny dynamic going on in these schools. Nonetheless, there has been a major shift in the composition of formerly white schools. And the same goes for the higher educational institutions such as this university. The other thing which I think must attract our attention is the way in which the private sector of education is increasing. And I don't think enough work seems to have been done on this. We don't have too many private universities. The government has been quite cautious about letting private universities in, but there's been a massive expansion of private schools. Obviously, the elite schools in this country have a long tradition. Little England on the Veld. And those are increasingly becoming black as well. But what is more interesting is the schools, the massive expansion of schools which is happening below those elite schools. The Crawfords of this world, and a lot of all sorts of institutions growing up in places like Bramfontein. You see them on the second story of office blocks and so forth. A massive expansion about which I don't think we know enough. But clearly what is happening is a massive movement of black kids out of townships into any schools which their parents can afford. A massive shift, I think, in social mobility being made. Finally, the most explicit strategy of class formation has been BEE, and we know it's been politically leveraged. It's had a mixed record and so forth. Criticisms that it has been the maker of or encouraging a shift to crony capitalism and so forth. On the other hand, we might also say, how on earth could South Africa, 20 years of democracy, not have a lot an increased number of black people within the higher echelons of the private sector. So the argument follows broadly is that the black elite and middle class has found itself in a position of power, privilege and profit. That's a little bit strong, but basically the argument is that the black middle class is not likely to bite the hand that feeds it. I've looked previously at 4 segments of the black middle class: state managers, what I term the corporate black bourgeoisie, the civil petty bourgeoisie, and the black business and trading bourgeoisie. And my basic argument here is that the more dependent these various segments are upon the relationship to the party state, the more likely they are to remain in close touch with the ANC. We can come back to that later, because I'm sure I'm going to be running out of time. Finally, the black middle class and the consolidation of democracy. We've had a lot of feverish expectation in the run-up to the last election about where the black middle class was going to go in terms of its vote. We see a lot of dynamics going on within the DA about trying to change its racial profile and so on and so forth. We had a lot of speculation about Hagang was going to capture the black middle class vote and so on and so forth. And I think that certainly the ANC was reasonably concerned in the lead up to the last election about the nature of the black middle class orientation, particularly after Jacob Zuma was booed at Mandela's funeral memorial in Soweto. And of course, there have been grumblings about clever blacks and so on. The ANC's electoral hegemony, nonetheless, since 1994, has continued to be based upon the notion of cross-class alliance. The thrust of that message, funnily enough, came out of a survey reported upon by Lawrence Schlemmer in 2005. He argued that race-based transformation had forged a strong bond between the ANC and the black middle class. He and he argued that that this gave the black middle class a strong sense of solidarity with the ruling party. Nonetheless, it expressed numerous misgivings about the ANC in power. In fact, some of the respondents to the ANC, to the survey, reported that they were thinking about political alternatives, suggesting that the African middle class was not indelibly bound to the ANC, suggesting that its support for the ANC was pragmatic and anything other than consistent. And so this suggested that there is a greater propensity with urbanisation and so on for black middle class people to move away from the ANC. However, qualified that, he argued that there was a very sustained belief amongst the black middle class that white wealth was a product of the racist past, which didn't bode too well for the DA. And you might have argued that if